Have you ever woken up after what seemed like a full night's sleep and still felt mentally exhausted? Not physically tired, but cognitively slow. Foggy. Unfocused. As though your brain simply refuses to engage. This experience is far more common than most people realize. And crucially, it reveals something important: sleep duration and mental restoration are not the same thing.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
For much of modern history, sleep was viewed as a passive state, a shutdown mode for the body. However, contemporary neuroscience paints a very different picture. Research from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke demonstrates that sleep is an active biological process, during which the brain reorganizes neural connections, consolidates memory, and clears metabolic waste. One of the most significant discoveries in recent decades involves what scientists call the glymphatic system. Studies published in Nature Neuroscience describe how, during deep sleep, cerebrospinal fluid flows through brain tissue, effectively washing away accumulated waste products, including beta-amyloid proteins. This cleaning mechanism operates most efficiently during slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage of non-REM sleep. If your sleep lacks sufficient deep sleep, your brain may not complete this nightly maintenance. You may have slept for 8 hours, but your brain may not have fully recovered. Another factor involves cognitive load. Modern life imposes an unprecedented volume of information processing. Emails, notifications, decision-making, multitasking. Research from Harvard Medical School shows that sustained mental effort increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function. When this region is repeatedly taxed without adequate recovery, individuals experience what psychologists refer to as decision fatigue. Even if sleep duration appears adequate, persistent cognitive overload can leave neural circuits functionally depleted. Stress further complicates the equation. The hormone cortisol follows a circadian rhythm, typically peaking in the morning and declining throughout the day. However, chronic stress disrupts this rhythm. According to research, irregular cortisol patterns impair sleep architecture, reducing deep sleep and fragmenting REM cycles. In practical terms, this means you may remain physiologically on alert during the night, even if you do not consciously wake. Your body lies still, but your nervous system does not fully power down. There is also the matter of sleep quality versus sleep quantity. Alcohol consumption, late-night screen exposure, and inconsistent bedtimes interfere with melatonin production and circadian alignment. Blue light emitted from digital devices delays the release of melatonin. Over time, this leads to circadian misalignment, a subtle but powerful disruption. You may sleep long enough, but at the wrong biological phase. The result is social jet lag. Inflammation plays a quieter but equally important role. Emerging evidence suggests that low-grade systemic inflammation can impair both sleep depth and alertness. The immune system and the nervous system are closely intertwined. When one is dysregulated, the other follows. So what does this mean? It means that mental fatigue is rarely caused by sleep duration alone. It reflects a complex interaction. To feel mentally restored, the brain requires sufficient slow-wave sleep, stable circadian rhythms, reduced evening stimulation, manageable cognitive load, and regulated stress hormones. Without these conditions, sleep becomes incomplete, even if it appears sufficient on the surface. The paradox of modern fatigue is this: we often focus on sleeping longer when what we truly require is sleeping better. And perhaps more importantly, living in a way that allows the brain to recover. The next time you wake feeling mentally drained, it may not be a failure of sleep itself. It may be a signal that your brain has been working harder than you realized. Now consider this: do you feel physically rested but mentally foggy? Or mentally sharp but physically drained? What is draining your brain the most? Let us know in the comments. In a world of constant notifications, infinite scrolling, and algorithm-driven distraction, the ability to focus may be one of the rarest cognitive skills of the 21st century. Yet focus is not a personality trait. It is not something you are simply born with. It is a neurological function, measurable, adaptable, and trainable. Today, we examine the science of attention, how it works inside the brain, why it fails, and how you can deliberately strengthen it.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
Attention is not a single process. It is a coordinated system involving multiple brain networks. Research from institutions such as Harvard University and Stanford University shows that focus depends heavily on the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive control, planning, and decision-making. Two major systems regulate attention. First, the executive control network, which allows you to deliberately focus on a chosen task. Second, the salient network, which detects what is novel, urgent, or emotionally relevant. When you attempt to concentrate on a report, a book, or a complex idea, your executive system works to suppress competing signals. However, every notification, sound, or new stimulus activates the salient network. The brain evolved to prioritize novelty. In evolutionary terms, distraction once meant survival. Modern environments overload this system. Digital platforms are engineered to trigger dopamine release, the neurotransmitter associated with reward prediction and motivation. Each notification provides a small, variable reward. This unpredictability strengthens habitual checking behavior. Cognitive research demonstrates that frequent multitasking reduces performance on tasks requiring sustained attention. Task switching is not efficient. It carries a measurable cognitive cost. Each switch forces the prefrontal cortex to reconfigure goals, inhibit previous information, and allocate mental resources again. Over time, repeated switching trains the brain to expect interruption. Attention is also metabolically expensive. The brain consumes significant energy during sustained cognitive effort. When mental fatigue increases, the brain defaults to easier stimuli, typically fast, rewarding, low-effort content. This is not laziness. It is an energy management mechanism. Yet here lies the central scientific principle, neuroplasticity. The brain rewires itself according to repeated behavior. Circuits that are used frequently become stronger. Circuits that are neglected weaken. If distraction can be reinforced, so can focus. So how do we train attention deliberately? First, monotasking. Working memory performs best when limited to a single demanding objective. Training yourself to complete defined focus intervals, for example, 25 to 45 minutes, strengthens executive control. The key is consistency. Each uninterrupted session reinforces neural stability. Second, reduce environmental triggers. Remove digital cues before beginning deep work. Silence notifications. Place devices out of reach. The absence of external signals reduces activation of the salient network and lowers cognitive friction. Third, mindfulness practice. Structured attention training, such as focused breath meditation, improves attentional stability and reduces mind wandering. Even brief daily sessions have been associated with measurable changes in functional connectivity between attention-related brain regions. Fourth, biological foundations. Sleep directly affects prefrontal regulation. Even mild sleep deprivation impairs sustained attention and decision-making. Regular aerobic exercise increases cerebral blood flow and supports neural resilience. Focus is not purely psychological, it is physiological. Attention behaves like a muscle, but only metaphorically. More accurately, it is a dynamic network shaped by reinforcement. Each moment of sustained focus strengthens synaptic pathways. Each moment of impulsive switching strengthens the opposite pattern. The question, therefore, is not whether you can focus. The question is what you are repeatedly teaching your brain to prioritize. Focus is not disappearing in the modern world. It is being redirected. The same neuroplastic mechanisms that allow distraction to flourish also allow discipline to grow. If your brain rewires itself according to what you repeatedly do, what are you training it for today? Let me know in the comments, what is your biggest obstacle to sustained focus, distraction, fatigue, or motivation? What actually happens inside your brain when you exercise? Most people think of exercise as something that strengthens muscles, improves cardiovascular health, or helps manage body weight. But modern neuroscience shows something far more profound. Physical activity is not merely a bodily function, it is a biological intervention that directly alters brain chemistry, structure, and long-term cognitive resilience.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
The moment you begin to move, whether running, cycling, or even brisk walking, your heart rate increases. This increase in cardiac output pushes more oxygen-rich blood to the brain. Enhanced cerebral blood flow improves nutrient delivery and waste removal. The brain, despite representing only about 2% of body mass, consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy. Exercise ensures that this metabolically demanding organ receives greater support. Within minutes, neurotransmitters begin to shift. Dopamine levels rise. Dopamine is central to motivation and reward processing. This is partly why exercise can feel energizing or even mildly addictive. Serotonin increases as well, contributing to mood regulation. Endorphins are released, reducing pain perception and contributing to the runner's high. However, the most significant long-term effect may not be these immediate chemical changes. It is structural. Research published in the PNAS demonstrated that regular aerobic exercise increases the size of the hippocampus, the brain region crucial for learning and memory. The hippocampus is also one of the few areas in the adult brain where neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons, can occur. For decades, neuroscientists believed the adult brain could not generate new neurons. That assumption has since been overturned. Exercise is now recognized as one of the strongest natural stimulators of adult neurogenesis. The key mediator of this process is a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. Sometimes referred to as fertilizer for the brain, BDNF supports neuronal survival, growth, and synaptic plasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and strengthen neural connections. Elevated BDNF levels correlate with improved memory formation and faster learning. Exercise increases BDNF expression significantly, especially through sustained aerobic activity. In practical terms, this means movement physically strengthens the architecture of thought. Research suggests that regular physical activity is associated with reduced risk of cognitive decline and neurodegenerative conditions. While exercise is not a cure, it appears to act as a protective factor, enhancing what neuroscientists called cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve refers to the brain's resilience against age-related damage. But the benefits extend beyond memory. Exercise also affects the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, decision-making, and impulse control. Acute bouts of exercise have been shown to improve attention span and task-switching performance. In educational settings, students who engage in moderate physical activity often demonstrate improved concentration and working memory. There is also a stress regulation dimension. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, which in excessive amounts can impair hippocampal function. Exercise, paradoxically a physical stressor, improves the regulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Over time, individuals who exercise regularly often exhibit more balanced cortisol responses to psychological stress. In other words, exercise trains the brain not only to grow, but to regulate itself more effectively. The intensity of activity matters, but perhaps less than consistency. Moderate aerobic exercise 3 to 5 times per week is sufficient. High-intensity interval training may further amplify certain effects, though research continues to refine these comparisons. Importantly, these neurological changes are cumulative. A single workout may improve mood temporarily. Weeks begin to modify connectivity. Months and years of regular movement reshape brain structure in measurable ways. This reframes exercise entirely. It is not simply a lifestyle choice. It is a neurobiological investment. Every step, every repetition, sends a cascade of molecular signals that influence how you think, remember, focus, and feel. The brain is not separate from the body, it is profoundly shaped by it. So the next time you consider skipping a workout, it may be worth asking, are you neglecting your muscles or your mind? Have you noticed changes in your focus or mood after exercise? Let us know in the comments. Your experience reflects what neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Stress is often described as an emotion, something we feel during deadlines, conflict, or uncertainty. But biologically, stress is not merely a feeling. It is a full-body survival mechanism that can physically reshape the structure and function of your brain. To understand how stress rewires the brain, we must first go back to the foundations of modern stress research.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
In the 1930s, endocrinologist Hans Selye described what he called the general adaptation syndrome. He proposed that stress is a universal biological response to threat, whether physical or psychological. When the brain perceives danger, it activates the hypothalamic and pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. This triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline. In the short term, this system is remarkably adaptive. Your heart rate increases. Glucose floods your bloodstream. Your attention sharpens. Reaction time improves. This acute stress response helped our ancestors survive predators, environmental hazards, and conflict. It is not inherently harmful. The problem arises when stress becomes chronic. Modern stress rarely involves physical predators. Instead, it is persistent financial pressure, social instability, academic competition, workplace demands. When stress does not switch off, cortisol levels remain elevated for extended periods. And this is where structural changes begin. Let us examine three key brain regions. First, the amygdala. This almond-shaped structure deep within the temporal lobe. It is central to fear processing and threat detection. Chronic stress strengthens neural connections in the amygdala, increasing its reactivity. Research published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience shows that prolonged exposure to stress hormones enhances dendritic growth in this region. In simple terms, the amygdala becomes more sensitive. The brain becomes primed to detect danger, even when none exists. This explains why chronically stressed individuals often feel anxious, hypervigilant, or emotionally reactive. Second, the hippocampus. This region is essential for memory consolidation and contextual learning. Unlike the amygdala, the hippocampus tends to shrink under chronic stress. Studies from Harvard Medical School demonstrate this reduction. Prolonged cortisol exposure can reduce hippocampal volume and impair neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. The hippocampus is particularly vulnerable because it contains a high density of cortisol receptors. Excess cortisol disrupts synaptic plasticity. This can lead to memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and reduced cognitive flexibility. Third, the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function, decision-making, impulse control, and rational thought. Chronic stress reduces activity and connectivity in this region. Neuroimaging studies indicate weakened prefrontal regulation. In practical terms, this means emotional impulses become stronger, while rational control becomes weaker. The brain shifts from deliberate thinking to reactive survival mode. So, what we call stress is not just psychological discomfort. It is a biological shift in neural balance. However, the story does not end there. The same principle that allows stress to rewire the brain, neuroplasticity, also allows recovery. The brain is not static. It adapts continuously to experience. When stresses are reduced and recovery mechanisms are activated, structural changes can partially reverse. Physical exercise promotes hippocampal neurogenesis. Sleep restores synaptic balance. Mindfulness practices reduce amygdala reactivity. Social support buffers cortisol responses. Research from the APA highlights that resilience is a dynamic biological capacity. Neural circuits can be reshaped again in healthier directions. This dual nature of neuroplasticity is crucial. The brain does not distinguish between good or bad rewiring. It adapts to repeated input. Chronic fear strengthens fear circuits. Chronic calm strengthens regulatory circuits. Understanding this shifts the narrative. Stress is not weakness. It is biology. But unmanaged chronic stress is not neutral. It gradually alters neural architecture. What daily patterns are you reinforcing right now? Are you repeatedly activating threat circuits? Or are you strengthening recovery circuits? The brain you will have 5 years from now is being sculpted today. What strategies should societies, workplaces, and individuals prioritize to protect long-term cognitive health? Let us know in the comments, do you think modern life is biologically mismatched with the stress system we evolved for?
At some point in life, almost everyone has asked the same question: can I actually improve my memory? Or is memory simply a fixed trait, something you are born with and cannot meaningfully change? To answer that, we must first understand what memory truly is. Memory is not a single system. It is a collection of processes involving encoding, storage, and retrieval.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
When you encounter new information, your brain encodes it. If that information is stabilized, it becomes stored. And when needed, it is retrieved. These processes rely heavily on the hippocampus and distributed cortical networks. In the 20th century, neuroscientist Eric Kandel demonstrated that memory formation is linked to physical changes in synapses, the connections between neurons. When neurons repeatedly fire together, their connections strengthen, a process known as long-term potentiation. This principle reveals something crucial: memory is biological, but it is also plastic. Neuroplasticity means the brain can reorganize itself structurally and functionally in response to experience. That alone suggests memory is not fixed. But plasticity does not mean unlimited expansion. Working memory, the system responsible for holding information temporarily, was extensively studied by psychologist Alan Baddeley. Research suggests that working memory capacity has limits. You cannot infinitely increase the number of items you can hold at once. However, you can improve how efficiently you use that capacity. This distinction is critical. Improving memory capacity and improving memory performance are not the same thing. Let us examine what science actually supports. First, spaced repetition. Instead of cramming information in a single session, distributing study over time significantly improves long-term retention. Research by cognitive psychologist Henry Roediger III demonstrates that retrieval practice, actively recalling information, strengthens memory traces far more effectively than passive rereading. The mechanism is elegant. Each act of retrieval reinforces neural pathways, making future recall easier. In other words, remembering strengthens remembering. Second, sleep. Memory consolidation occurs during sleep, particularly slow-wave and REM stages. Studies from Harvard Medical School show that sleep helps stabilize and reorganize memories, transferring them from temporary hippocampal storage into longer-term cortical networks. Without adequate sleep, encoding and consolidation suffer dramatically. Third, physical exercise. Aerobic activity has been shown to increase blood flow to the brain and stimulate the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a molecule that supports neuronal growth. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences demonstrated that regular exercise can even increase hippocampal volume in adults. Fourth, attention and focus. Memory begins with attention. If encoding is weak, storage will be weak. Reducing multitasking and strengthening attentional control improves initial encoding quality. In this sense, improving focus indirectly improves memory. Now we must address a controversial topic: brain training games. Commercial cognitive training programs often claim to expand memory capacity. However, evidence suggests that improvements tend to be task-specific. You may become better at the trained task itself, but the transfer to general memory ability is limited. The brain adapts, but it adapts specifically. So can you truly improve memory? Yes, but with nuance. You can improve memory efficiency. You can enhance encoding strategies. You can strengthen retrieval pathways. You can optimize biological conditions through sleep and exercise. You can reduce interference and improve attention. What you likely cannot do is transform your brain into a photographic memory machine. Memory is not about perfection. It is about reliability and reinforcement. Historically, humans have always sought memory enhancement. Ancient Greek orators developed mnemonic systems such as the method of Loki, placing information within imagined spatial environments. Modern neuroscience now explains why such techniques work. They recruit spatial memory networks in the hippocampus, creating richer associative encoding. The principle has not changed in 2,000 years. Stronger associations create stronger recall. Ultimately, improving memory is less about expanding mental storage and more about understanding how memory naturally functions. When you align your habits with neuroscience, spacing practice, prioritizing sleep, exercising regularly, engaging in retrieval, improvement is not mystical. It is biological. The real question is not whether memory can improve. The real question is whether we are willing to adopt the behaviors that allow it to improve. So now I leave you with this. Have you ever experienced a dramatic improvement in your memory after changing a specific habit, such as sleep, exercise, or study method? Share your experience in the comments below.
Have you ever felt exhausted, but not just physically tired? As if your motivation has drained away, your focus feels foggy, and even simple tasks demand enormous effort? That feeling might not be laziness. It might not even be ordinary stress. It could be burnout. In 2019, the World Health Organization officially classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon. But burnout is more than a workplace buzzword. It is a measurable biological state, one that changes how your brain functions under prolonged stress. To understand burnout, we first need to understand stress itself.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
Stress is not inherently bad. In fact, it evolved as a survival mechanism. When you face a threat, your brain activates the HPA axis. This triggers the release of cortisol, your primary stress hormone. In short bursts, cortisol is helpful. It sharpens attention and mobilizes energy. But when stress becomes chronic, day after day, month after month, this system never truly switches off. And that is where the trouble begins. Neuroscientist Bruce McEwen introduced the concept of allostatic load. It refers to the cumulative wear and tear on the body and brain. Think of it as biological mileage. Over time, elevated cortisol begins to affect the brain itself. Let's start with the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for focus and control. Under chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient. Studies show stress weakens neural connections, making it harder to concentrate or plan. This is why burnout often feels like mental fog. Next, the hippocampus, crucial for memory, is highly sensitive to cortisol. Research has shown that prolonged exposure to high cortisol levels can reduce hippocampal volume. This explains the forgetfulness reported in burnout. And then there is the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. Under chronic stress, the amygdala can become more reactive, increasing anxiety and sensitivity. The more reactive the amygdala becomes, the more stress you perceive and the more cortisol is released. Burnout is neurological imbalance. Psychologist Christina Maslick describes burnout as emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. It is overwhelming. When the prefrontal cortex weakens, motivation drops. Your brain is not broken. It is overloaded. You are in survival mode. Burnout is not identical to depression. While they share symptoms, burnout is specifically linked to chronic stress exposure. The brain has the capacity to recover. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, remains active throughout life. So what helps? First, reducing chronic stress input. This involves workload changes, clearer boundaries, and recovery periods. Without lowering the stress signal, the HPA axis cannot recalibrate. Second, restorative sleep. During deep sleep, cortisol decreases and the brain clears metabolic waste. Sleep is essential neurological maintenance. Third, physical activity regulates cortisol and increases BDNF, strengthening neural connections in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Fourth, social connection. Positive social interaction reduces perceived threat levels and lowers stress hormone output. Isolation, on the other hand, amplifies it. Your nervous system is adaptive. If it is under constant demand, it will shift into survival mode. How long has your brain been in defense mode? Understanding burnout scientifically removes the shame. It replaces self-blame with biology. And biology can be influenced through intentional restoration. In your daily life, what is adding to your load and what is helping you recover? Let me know in the comments. Understanding your own mind is the first step. Dopamine. Few brain chemicals have been talked about more in recent years and misunderstood just as much. You have probably heard that dopamine is the pleasure chemical, that it is responsible for addiction, that social media is frying your dopamine receptors, or that you need a dopamine detox to reset your brain. But what if most of that is an oversimplification? Today, we are going to explain dopamine without the hype.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
First, what is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger that neurons use to communicate. It is produced primarily in a few small areas of the brain, including the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. From there, dopamine neurons project to different regions, forming distinct pathways with different functions. There are three major dopamine pathways you should know. The nigrostriatal pathway helps control movement. When dopamine-producing neurons in this pathway degenerate, as in Parkinson's disease, people experience tremors and difficulty initiating movement. The mesolimbic pathway connects the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. This pathway is often called the reward pathway, but that label can be misleading. The mesocortical pathway projects to the prefrontal cortex and is involved in motivation, planning, and executive control. So dopamine is not just about pleasure. It is deeply involved in movement, decision-making, learning, and motivation. Now let us tackle the biggest myth. Is dopamine the pleasure chemical? Not exactly. Groundbreaking research by neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz showed that dopamine neurons fire not when we experience pleasure itself, but when something is better than expected. This is called a reward prediction error. Imagine you try a new cafe and expect average coffee, but it turns out to be excellent. Dopamine neurons spike. Not because the coffee tastes good per se, but because it exceeded your expectation. The next time you go, if the coffee is just as good as expected, dopamine activity is lower. If it is worse than expected, dopamine activity can actually dip. This suggests dopamine is less about pleasure and more about learning and prediction. It helps your brain update its model of the world. Over time, dopamine responses shift. Instead of firing when the reward arrives, neurons begin firing when the cue predicting the reward appears. That is why a notification sound can feel motivating. The cue itself carries predictive value. Dopamine teaches your brain what is worth pursuing. Now let us talk about addiction. Addictive substances such as nicotine, cocaine, or alcohol increase dopamine levels. Drugs hijack the brain's learning system. They create artificially large dopamine signals. Over time, the brain adapts. Receptors may downregulate. natural rewards may feel less motivating. But again, this is not about burning out your dopamine. The system is plastic, not permanently broken. What about social media? Yes, unpredictable rewards, like variable notifications, can engage dopamine systems. This is similar to how slot machines work. The real issue is behavioral reinforcement. If an app repeatedly delivers small, unpredictable rewards, your brain learns to check it frequently. Now, the popular idea of a dopamine detox. Scientifically speaking, there is no evidence that avoiding stimulation resets your dopamine levels. However, reducing overstimulation can help recalibrate your attention. Not because you are draining dopamine, but because you are interrupting learned behavioral loops. Dopamine is not a moral chemical. It is not the villain of modern life. It is a teaching signal. It energizes behavior when something is worth pursuing. It helps you allocate effort. It shapes habits. Too little dopamine can impair motivation. Too much can contribute to psychosis. Balance matters, but balance is complex. So instead of asking, how do I hack my dopamine? A better question might be, what am I teaching my brain to value? Because every repeated behavior, every cue and reward loop is gradually sculpting your motivational system. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It is about prediction. It is about learning. It is about drive. And once you understand that, the hype becomes less convincing and the science becomes far more interesting. So here is a question for you. If dopamine is about learning what to pursue, what habits do you think you are currently training your brain to prioritize? We've all been told that multitasking is a skill. Answer emails while on a meeting. Scroll your phone while watching a lecture. Write a report while replying to messages. It feels efficient. It feels productive. But what if multitasking is actually slowing you down? Modern neuroscience gives us a surprising answer. Your brain does not truly multitask. It switches. And that switching comes at a cost.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
Let's start with a simple fact about the brain. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, decision-making, and attention control, has limited capacity. It cannot fully process multiple demanding tasks at the same time. Instead, it rapidly shifts attention from one task to another. This process is called task switching. Research from Stanford University by Clifford Nass and colleagues found that heavy multitaskers actually perform worse on attention and memory tasks. They struggle more with filtering irrelevant information and show reduced cognitive control compared to people who focus on one task at a time. In other words, the people who think they're best at multitasking are often the worst at it. But why exactly does this happen to our brains? Every time you switch tasks, your brain must reorient. It needs to unload one rule set and load another. This transition may feel instant, but it consumes mental energy. Psychologists call this the switch cost. According to reports by the American Psychological Association, task switching can reduce productivity by up to 40%. A full 40% loss in performance. Imagine losing nearly half your productive time, not because you're lazy, but because your brain architecture simply isn't designed for parallel complex processing. There's also something known as attention residue. Research by Sophie Leroy shows that when you move from task A to task B, part of your attention remains stuck on task A. Your cognitive resources are divided, even if you believe you've moved on. So when you check a message while writing a report, your brain doesn't fully return to the report immediately. A fraction of your focus is still occupied by the conversation you just read. This fragmentation reduces depth of thinking. And depth is where real productivity lives. Let's connect this to cognitive load theory, developed by John Sweller. Working memory, the mental space where we process information, is extremely limited. When you overload it with competing inputs, performance declines. It's not about willpower. It's about bandwidth. Imagine trying to stream multiple high-definition videos on a weak internet connection. Everything buffers. Nothing runs smoothly. Your brain works in a similar way. Multitasking also increases errors. When you divide attention, accuracy drops. Reaction time slows. Decision quality declines. In high-stakes environments like medicine or aviation, even small attention shifts can have serious consequences. But what about simple tasks? Can we multitask then? Yes, if one task is automatic. Walking while talking. Listening to music while cleaning. These work because one activity requires minimal executive control. The problem arises when both tasks demand conscious attention. Writing an essay and texting. Analyzing data and responding to emails. Studying while scrolling social media. That's not multitasking. That's rapid context switching. And context switching exhausts the brain. Over time, chronic multitasking increases mental fatigue. The constant dopamine hits from switching tasks, especially digital notifications, train the brain to crave novelty. Focus becomes harder. Sustained attention feels uncomfortable. You don't just lose time. You lose cognitive stamina. And here's the paradox: multitasking feels productive because you're constantly active. But activity is not the same as progress. Deep work requires uninterrupted time. It allows neural networks to synchronize. It allows ideas to compound. It enables problem-solving at a higher level. Single tasking, by contrast, may feel slower at first. But it reduces switch costs. It eliminates attention residue. It protects working memory capacity. And ultimately, it accelerates meaningful output. So how can you apply this? Batch similar tasks together. Turn off non-essential notifications. Use structured focus intervals. Finish before you switch. Train your attention like a muscle. Because in the end, productivity isn't about doing more at once. It's about doing one thing fully. Now here's a question for you. Have you ever tried eliminating multitasking for a full day? Did you feel more focused or more restless? Let me know your experience in the comments. What if I told you that your brain does not suddenly start declining at 30, but actually begins reorganizing itself in fascinating ways? Turning 30 is often treated like a biological deadline. Slower memory, reduced creativity, cognitive decline. But neuroscience paints a far more nuanced and surprisingly hopeful picture. Let's begin with structure.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
By our early 30s, certain regions of the brain begin to show gradual changes in volume. MRI studies show that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and impulse control, slowly becomes thinner over time. This process is called cortical thinning. But thinning does not mean failure. In fact, some degree of pruning and refinement is part of normal brain optimization. The brain reduces redundant connections and strengthens frequently used pathways. It's like upgrading a network for efficiency. White matter, the brain's communication highways, also changes after 30. Research shows its integrity shifts across adulthood. Processing speed may subtly slow, not because intelligence drops, but because signal transmission becomes slightly less rapid. This is why you might occasionally feel that recalling a name takes longer than it did at 20. But here is the critical distinction: slower retrieval is not the same as memory loss. In fact, your accumulated knowledge, vocabulary, and life experience often continues to improve well into your 40s. Many studies show vocabulary peaks in middle adulthood. So while reaction speed may dip, wisdom often rises. Now let's talk about neuroplasticity. For years, scientists believed that adult brains were largely fixed. But research has shown that the brain remains adaptable throughout life. Even after 30, new neural pathways can form. Skills can be learned. Habits can be rewired. The brain is not a static machine. The hippocampus, essential for memory formation, may show gradual volume reductions with age. However, lifestyle factors strongly influence this trajectory. Aerobic exercise and sleep quality are vital. Learning new skills has been linked to maintaining hippocampal health. In other words, biology is not destiny. Another fascinating shift after 30 involves emotional regulation. Responses may become more regulated over time. Older adults often display stronger connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Researchers call this the positivity effect, the tendency to prioritize meaningful experiences over novelty seeking. So why does the brain decline after 30's myth persist? Because we tend to measure youth by speed. But cognitive performance is multidimensional. Vocabulary and strategic thinking often remain stable or improve. There is also something called cognitive reserve. It refers to the brain's resilience against age-related change. Education, intellectual engagement, and social interaction build neural redundancy. This means your brain develops alternative pathways to perform tasks if others weaken. People with higher cognitive reserve often show fewer symptoms of decline, even if structural changes are present. And here is the most reassuring fact: normal aging is not dementia. One is typical, the other is pathological. So what actually changes after 30? Processing speed may slow. Certain regions thin. White matter shifts. But emotional stability strengthens. Experience accumulates. Neural networks reorganize. Wisdom deepens. Your brain is not shutting down. It is adapting. And the trajectory is shaped by how you live. Regular exercise increases blood flow and neurotrophic factors like BDNF. Sleep supports glymphatic clearance and memory consolidation. It is the brain's cleaning cycle. Learning new skills stimulates synaptic growth. Social connection strengthens empathy circuits. After 30, your brain becomes less impulsive and more selective, less reactive and more reflective. Perhaps the real question is not whether your brain changes after 30. It clearly does. The real question is, are you guiding those changes or ignoring them? Science suggests something powerful. Age does not simply reduce capacity. It reshapes it. Your brain is a masterpiece in progress. So now I'd like to ask you, have you noticed any mental changes since turning 30? Slower recall, deeper insight, or better emotional control? Share your experience in the comments. Have you ever noticed that after hours of intense thinking, your brain feels heavy? Not sleepy. Not physically exhausted. Just mentally drained. You sit in front of your work, fully aware of what needs to be done, yet even simple decisions suddenly feel difficult. Concentration slips. Motivation drops. Small tasks feel disproportionately demanding. This is mental fatigue. And it is not laziness.
Welcome to SciCuriousID, where curiosity meets science.
Mental fatigue is a measurable neurobiological state, one that reflects changes in how your brain allocates energy, regulates neurotransmitters, and evaluates effort. To understand it, we need to begin with one simple fact: your brain is an energy-hungry organ. Although it makes up only about 2% of your body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of your body's resting energy. Most of that energy supports neural signaling, the constant firing of neurons and restoration of ion gradients that make thinking possible. But interestingly, global brain energy consumption does not drastically increase. Instead, what changes is local energy allocation. Certain regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex, become more active. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive control, planning, decision-making, inhibition, working memory. When you study for hours, solve complex problems, or resist distractions, this region works intensively. Over time, prolonged activation alters neurochemical balance. One key player is dopamine. Dopamine is often described as the reward chemical, but in reality, it plays a crucial role in motivation. It plays a crucial role in motivation and cost-benefit evaluation. Your brain constantly asks, is this effort worth it? Research shows that after extended cognitive effort, dopamine signaling shifts. Tasks that previously seemed worthwhile begin to feel costly. The subjective experience? I just can't be bothered. This does not mean your brain is out of fuel like a car running on empty. Instead, it is recalibrating effort valuation. Another important structure is the anterior cingulate cortex. This region monitors conflict, errors, and cognitive demand. It acts like a control center, detecting when tasks require sustained attention. When cognitive demand remains high for too long, neural networks associated with control show reduced efficiency. The system becomes less coordinated. But there is more. One influential model, known as the opportunity cost model, suggests that mental fatigue arises because your brain is weighing alternative activities. If you have been doing one demanding task for hours, your brain begins to compute the value of switching to something else. That internal restlessness? That urge to check your phone? That reflects shifting internal cost calculations. Importantly, mental fatigue is not identical to sleepiness. Sleep pressure is regulated by adenosine accumulation and circadian rhythms. Mental fatigue can occur even when you are fully rested. It is tied more closely to sustained cognitive control than to sleep deprivation. That said, sleep deprivation amplifies mental fatigue dramatically. So what is actually happening? First, neural circuits involved in executive control become metabolically stressed at a local level. Second, dopamine-related signaling shifts effort valuation. Third, cognitive control networks lose efficiency. The result is a subjective sense of difficulty, irritability, reduced persistence, and impaired decision-making. Interestingly, studies show that mental fatigue affects not only cognitive performance but also physical endurance. When participants perform prolonged cognitive tasks, they later quit physical exercise earlier. The brain's perception of effort influences the body. So what can we do? Short breaks restore performance more effectively than pushing continuously. Alternating task types reduces local neural strain. Exposure to natural environments has been shown to improve attentional restoration. And perhaps most importantly, reframe mental fatigue as a biological signal. Instead of forcing ourselves with guilt, we can manage cognitive load strategically. Because mental fatigue is not proof of weakness. It is evidence that your brain has been working hard. The next time your focus fades, remember your brain is recalculating cost, effort, and reward. The question is not whether you are lazy. The question is, what is your brain trying to optimize? What strategies help you recover? Share your experience in the comments below.
Thanks for watching SciCuriousID. Until next time.